Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure to have you here, both in person and out there in our virtual audience. I'm delighted to welcome you to this first Senior Fellows Lunch, and we are so happy that the community is continuing to get together to interact on ideas and continue to be curious about the world around them. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land, but also the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So today I'm so excited about beginning this series. It's actually, and I'm just going to pass the mic to Dr. Jenkins, who's going to introduce our speakers. Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay. It is I'm Professor Jennifer Jenkins. I'm a professor of history and here at the U of T and a senior fellow of the college. And it is my great pleasure to introduce a new senior fellow at Massey College, Zainub Verjee. A thought leader, persuasive champion of the arts, and an advocate for artists' rights, Zainub Verjee has over 4 decades built a formidable reputation as an artist, a writer, a critic, a cultural administrator, and a public intellectual in Canada and internationally. She's a firm believer that art is a public good, which I think the college also stands for this idea. Zainub is an exceptional curator, writer, artist, and activist. She was awarded the Governor General's Award in 2020 in Visual and Media Arts for her outstanding contribution to the arts. Her work has been shown at the Museum for Modern Art in New York and at the Venice Biennale, among many other places. She's a very active member of civil society and has been part of or has founded a whole number of artists' organizations. I will just name a couple of them. She co-founded with Lorraine Chan the group Invisible Colors, which is a lovely pun, Invisible Colors or Invisible Colors, which is an international film and video festival that features work from women of color. So this is one outstanding example among many of her artistry and her activism. She is currently the executive director of the Ontario Association of Art Galleries and has been deeply engaged with the effects of COVID-19 on artists, their community, and their labor. Together with colleagues, Zainub has co-authored a letter on behalf of 75,000 artists. I had to make sure I was seeing that number correctly. On behalf of a huge number of artists, co-authored this letter that was sent to Prime Minister Trudeau on the topic of basic income for artists. Her work is important and inspiring, and we are so delighted to welcome you here to Massey College. Zainub's title today is, as you see here, Telos, Nomos, Ethos, and the Massey Report. Please join me in welcoming Zainub Verjee.
Well, as short people always have to step up and step up to the plate here today. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Natalie, for the opportunity to speak at this luncheon today, and Jennifer Jenkins for your really kind words of introduction. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I live and work on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Huron-Wendat. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. I am grateful for the teachings and relations of the Indigenous peoples. Now, the final report of Canada's Massey Commission, the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters and Sciences, was released in 1951. Often referred to as the Massey Report, this document provided the armature of what would become a state-defined national culture in Canada and gave birth to the idea of Canadian content as an act of cultural sovereignty. It was part of what was broadly known as the building of national cultures, a definitive trajectory that many nations followed post-World War II. On its 70th anniversary, it is imperative that we take stock of how far we have come and how we can together build a path forward for a better tomorrow and a stronger Canada. Massey Report has been a significant part of my professional life. I have engaged with it at different fora and contexts addressing multiple audiences. And this includes my lived interactions both with what the Massey Report represents, as well as my interventions in the domain of culture policy, highlighting 3 points. 1, the notion of a live document. 2, agency and change. And 3, the idea of the public good. Picking on the first point of the live document, the Massey Report is very much alive and touches our lives and shapes our imagination without perhaps us even consciously knowing it. Concomitant to this idea of a document is the second point of agency and change. The report defines both: how agency is constructed and activated, and change manifested. Agency and change have also been the leitmotif of my work. And thirdly, how the Massey Report sets us on the path of the public good in its direct invocation of culture as a common good. Now, I've been drawn to the Massey Report not as a currency of cathexis, but rather as a contemporary political problem, and more in terms of a philosophical problem, in such a way that it is difficult to disarticulate one from the other. In full disclosure, I have given a version of this talk at McLaughlin College at York University earlier this year, delineating the conundrum of cultural policy. As I speak again on the Massey Report, today's talk has a different valency. My focus for the talk today is to lay out my perspective on how Canada can strengthen its cultural sovereignty in the light of histories of empire and decolonization. The imperative of such an understanding calls for us to build a vision premised on 3 problematics: the Teleos, the raison d'etre of the political project of Canadian culture; nomos, the legal armature of Canadian culture; and ethos, the values and attitudes characteristic of the philosophy of the endeavor and ensuing cultural dynamics and relations. Now, I will focus on a slice of this history, broadly the tumultuous decades of the 80s and 90s to the 90s. And today I want to introduce one more idea, the idea of a controlling text. It is a text to which one would like to refer to find solutions to our problems. The text itself may or may not have a solution, but we, like every nation, every society, makes it a habit to fall back on a text. It becomes a reference point for all thinkers. Not to sound flippant, one can look at Das Kapital, or the makers of the American Constitution, or the Bhagavad Gita in India. You get the drift of my argument. I think the Massey Report would qualify to be the right text in Canada. It offers some kind of very fundamental thinking about Canada's ontology. Thus, beyond the notion of an unconscious archetype, the Massey Report to me is that Canadian controlling text. The Commission's mandate covered the entire field of letters, the arts, and sciences within the jurisdiction of the federal state. In the 2 years between 1949 to 51, the Commission hosted 114 public hearings in 16 cities in all 10 provinces. They received over 1,200 witnesses and 462 briefs. The Commission studies on specific topics. They established 4 advisory committees, met 224 times, and logged over 10,000 miles. When they finally reported in May 1951, the 517-page report contained 146 recommendations and was accompanied by 55 volumes of supporting documentation. The scope of the inquiry was unprecedented in Canada and has never been repeated. The Massey Report is a foundational document and remains so for the Canadian art and culture sector. 5 years after the release of the report, it saw the establishment of the Canada Council for the Arts, the creation of Libraries and Archives Canada, and an expansion of the National Film Board. Thus, not surprisingly, Massey Report becomes a subject and an object of scrutiny through my artistic lens as seen in the image. In this image, you are seeing the details of my artwork, Amnesia, at the 2020 Governor-General's Visual and Media Arts Award winners exhibition at the Art Gallery of Alberta. Now, the book, that is, the actual rare copy of the Massey Report, is presented as a sculptural piece, an installation, as a ready-made, to invoke Marcel Duchamp. And there's a couple of more images there of the installation. How do we make sense of the Massey Report in a contested space and time? In other words, how best can we historicize the Massey Report? As we know, to historicize is a double act. That is, to examine, 1, the relationship between us and the event, in this case the report, and 2, the relationship of the event with the other events that surround it. Historicizing is a particular method or way which insists on primacy and centrality of homogeneity of space and time. What we observe is that such homogeneity emerges with modernity and becomes a dominant feature. I will try to situate the Massey Report in the flows of modernity and make references to art discourse and cultural politics. Here I want to bring to your notice that this report is situated at the cross-section of British imperialism, decolonization, and the idea of the modern. In fact, Massey is the quintessential document of Canadian modernity. Now, with these brief framing thoughts, let's move on to the first problematic of the telos. Massey is situated in the matrix defined by colonial modernity on the one hand and global modernism on the other. This axis of modernity is a contested one, and it also produced counterflows. Let me offer you a few illustrations. First of all, there's a great churning about not only its meaning, but the future of modernism. For instance, post-Vietnam, the 1970s witnessed a crisis of politics in the United States, which was well captured in the September issue of Art Forum in 1970. Similarly, in 1981, Vancouver hosted a conference that brought to the forefront the rethinking of history and debates concerning modernism and modernity. It challenged both the orthodoxies of Greenberg on modernism and the reductive view of modernism then taking shape within the emerging doctrine of postmodernism. It is in this context that I was equally engaged with other articulations, especially those from the non-Western perspective. In an essay entitled Cruciality and the Frog's Perspective, an agenda for difficulties for the Black arts movement in Britain, British writer Paul Gilroy attempted to create a theoretical framework for discussing the cultural and political significance of Black arts in post-colonial Britain. Gilroy's short, dense, and challenging text raised a range of questions and issues which can be explored across different contexts and fields of cultural production. Gilroy adopted the term populist modernism in an attempt to force a conception of culture alternative to the one articulated in debates around postmodernism and its legacy in European philosophy and history. Instead, Gilroy proposed considering populist modernism as an aesthetic and political strategy. Third, the post-war decolonization led to global societal upheaval. Two competing centers, New York and Paris, gave their take on the situation in the 1984 MoMA exhibition, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinities of the Tribal and the Modern. In a response that wanted to correct MoMA, the 1989 Magicien de la Terre, curator Jean-Hubert Martin, presented works by more than 100 artists from 50 countries at the Centre Pompidou and the Grande Halle at Parc de la Villette in Paris. Now, often these exhibitions are spoken about in a binary, but I argue that they are part of a continuum initiated in 1954. And here I'm referring to the 1954 exhibition, Family of Man. It can be argued that Family of Man is premised on Harry Truman's doctrine and seeding the term development. Thus, the idea of development gets connected to progress as the primary evidence of modernity. Apart from these exhibitions as representative of the Western canon, what often gets missed are the other sites where different modernisms were being articulated. For example, the Indian Triennale in 1968, or for that matter, the first Arab Biennale in Baghdad, or the first Asian Biennale in Dhaka. The journey from the first Indian Triennale in 1968 to the first Asian Art Biennale in 1981 is a fascinating history of what I call multiple modernisms. Similarly, in 1959, the Alexandria Biennale produced a discourse on Mediterranean modernism. Also, the non-aligned countries produced a discourse on modernism. While I'll not get into the details here, but just to underline the key argument of the counterflows and the plurality of modernisms. Likewise, global modernism is a recent addition to the vocabulary, with the global turn implying the market after the Washington Consensus in 1995. Washington Consensus indicated the agreement between the IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury on financial assistance to third world countries on the condition of allowing the market to rule with no state interference. And this was organized to the World Trade Organization. This is the time when the notion of precarity of artists is introduced and artist labor becomes a central issue. Since then, artists and the sector have continually been asked to prove their value in economic terms. Arts have become an economic tool, a practice that began in the 80s after the report on the Applebaum-Ibert Committee, and on page 49, where it is trying to make a feeble case for spending public funds on culture. It is in this context that we have to understand how the term globalism is understood to be an outcome of the neoliberal globalization of the 1990s. Thus, how modernism via globalization, we see there is an onset of a homogenization process, and it is in this homogenization process that the erasures have occurred. As Faisal Derji, the Oxford historian, recently argued in a timely essay titled, "What is the West?" He describes, in the post-Cold War scenario, all politics would become a kind of internal mopping up operation, with the liberal world order no longer divided into East and West, and so made safe for capitalism. Politics was to be subordinated to economics, and the global triumph of neoliberalism represented this vision of the world made safe for the market and its mechanisms, end quote. On the other hand, at a normative level, global modernism might be understood in the context of the center-periphery relationship. In that sense, global modernism can be understood to reveal the agency of the periphery in the creation of modernity. In doing so, there is an imperative of thus countering Eurocentric understandings of global history and exposing the exploitation, violence, and uneven development that characterizes the modern world. The other point that I would like to make is the need to distinguish modernism in aesthetic terms from the institutionalization process. And what I'm saying is that modernism is not just an aesthetic term, but represents the politics and process of institutionalization. When we speak of global modernism, we need to understand that global modernism renders the sightlines of the West. It is a global turn in modernism. The challenge for us is how to excavate the Massey Report out of this contested modernism and redeploy it in the plurality of modernisms of a decolonizing order. Let's explore the nomos. Carl Schmitt, in his book, The Nomos of the Earth in 1950, argues that nomos explanation cannot be fully disengaged from the contingency of historical events, practices, and institutions. This offers a good segue to discuss the ambivalence of culture in the Canadian Constitutional Act and its subsequent implication on the deployment of cultural policy, especially in the context of post-Cold War globalization. The 1967 Confederation of Tomorrow Conference marked the beginning of the period of intense constitutional politics in Canada. In the wake of the failed Meech Lake Accord in 1990, Canada's political leaders got together for one more attempt at securing Quebec's support for the new constitution, which had been reformed 8 years earlier. The result, in 1992, was the Charlottetown Accord, developed with input from these various groups, along with the federal and provincial governments. It proposed a plethora of changes to the Constitution, some of which were criticized for being ill-defined and contradictory or a threat to individual rights and national unity. Let us look at arts and culture in the constitutional reform. On September 24, 1991, the Government of Canada tabled in the federal parliament a set of proposals for the renewal of the Canadian Federation entitled, quote, Shaping Canada's Future Together, end quote. And these proposals were referred to a special joint committee of the House of Commons and the Senate, which traveled across Canada seeking views on the proposals. The committee received 3,000 submissions and listened to testimony from 700 individuals. On page 35 of this document, the government outlines its position with regard to culture, and I quote, Our challenge, therefore, is to ensure, on the one hand, the maintenance of important Canada-wide institutions that help us to promote our identity. On the other hand, Canada's cultural policies and jurisdictions must offer the flexibility of ensuring that the roots of culture are enhanced and enriched, and that there are no impediments to provincial governments playing the roles they deem appropriate in the cultural field, end quote. And further it says, and this is consequential, the Government of Canada will therefore negotiate with the provinces upon their request agreements appropriate to the particular circumstances of each province to define clearly the role of each level of government, and where appropriate, such agreements would be constitutionalized. Now, the two committees were identified and the art sector was mobilized. One was the Special Joint Committee on a Renewed Canada, and the other was the Standing Committee on Communications and Culture. What does this imply about the constitutionality of culture? And I'm indebted to Patrick Monaghan, former Osgoode Dean, York U Provost, and Ontario Deputy Attorney General, and now Judge of Superior Court of Justice in Ontario, on his body of work on these contentious and constitutional issues pertaining to culture. His writings and analysis of these issues, especially during the times of Charlottetown Accord referendum, were insightful and influenced my understanding. I want to pick up on the deliberations of the Standing Committee on Communication and Culture and point out two key observations. One, significantly, it noted that the Constitution is silent on the issue of jurisdiction over culture. However, it clarified that provinces generally were to retain control over provincial and local matters, which would invariably include culture. And number two, it explored the idea of a cultural accord as a partnership between all levels of government, but did not offer any specifics, but just a general framework. However, the committee recommended that the cultural accord would not be constitutionalized. And I'm trying to drive your attention to the fact that what the committee says, that culture is not a category with any constitutional significance under the 1867 Constitutional Act. Either level of government is perfectly free to enact laws which might directly affect culture, as long as there is an appropriate constitutional foundation for such laws in the Act. And one may ask why. Often defined in terms of collective ways of being, the term culture is indeterminate and all-encompassing, that its inclusion would have rendered the entire division of powers almost incoherent. As we know, these things are decided by the courts and not politicians. But we can't undermine highly intelligent and creative politicians. To grasp the genius of the Massey Commission, here's a perfect example. The careful wording indicates that the federal policy would not pose a threat to the provinces. Thus, the terms of order in council for the Massey Commission read, quote, "In the national interest, to give encouragement to institutions which express national feeling, promote common understanding, and to add to the variety and richness of Canadian life, rural as well as urban." Massey's interpretation of the terms of order in council, what we were required to deal with were only certain threads, and to ascertain its significance, it will be imperative to inquire into the vast fabric. And this explains the vastness of the survey undertaken by the Commission. And more importantly, the Massey Report defines a new role for the government in relations to culture. It proposed that only a concentrated national policy will help counter American hegemony on the one hand and develop an Indigenous cultural community on the other. And the report specifically identifies, one, the role of arts as public pedagogy, two, the idea of pursuit of common good, and three, the imperative of anti-materialistic premise to develop Canadian thought and intellectual and cultural life. Now, given these observations, let me move to the last part, the ethos. Reading some recent scholarship reconfirmed some of my arguments, and I'm going to quote here J. Paquette et al. From their article, Settler Colonialism and Cultural Policy, the Colonial Foundations and Refoundations of Canadian Cultural Policy. And to quote, "The social, economic, and political effects of colonialism have had an enduring legacy on both the colonized and colonizers, particularly where questions of culture are concerned. Many of the remnants of colonialism are most saliently felt through cultural institutions and policies, through their acknowledgement and, in some cases, unbridled flaunting of colonial rules via established and ingrained social and political values and norms. In point of fact, many cultural institutions and policies have been traversed by colonial and imperial projects, in some cases even being complicit in their delivery. Here, ethos has to take into consideration the post-war decolonization and ensuing contestations. Right from the Bandung moment of the Afro-Asian Solidarity of 1955, we see post-war decolonization was essentially a project of reordering the world that sought to create a domination-free and egalitarian international order. The 1980s demonstrates that instead of marking the collapse of internationalism and the closure of alternative conceptions of a world, we see a continued effort to confront the legacies of imperial hierarchy with the demand for the radical reconstitution of the international order. And it is in this context we see that various broader political formations take, the Afro-Asian solidarity, Third World, and movements inherent, etc., played a central role actually in envisioning of this new order. And in Canada, through the mid-70s, up to the end of the decade of the 80s, saw a massive mobilization of Indigenous people, which led to multiple sites of exhibitions and resistance. I mean, prior to the 1974 event, the Anishinaabe Park takeover, the significance of cultural and political landscape at the time and following Expo 67 corresponded both to how the art world and the public metabolized Indigenous arts and the aesthetics Indigenous artists were producing. And this was in parallel to the birth of Red Power movement. Also, I think that, interestingly, my research demonstrated how the Kenora episode and Red Power developed solidarity with Third World solidarity movements of the 60s and 80s. And these movements had interconnected and intertwined activities, responses, influences, and consequences. Artistically, these movements stirred a responding aesthetic and agency. Now, there's lots of other things here, events that happened, the formation of Studio D, the program at NFB, the United Nations declared, 76 to 85 as a decade of women, and many other such things. But I'd like to move on and point to another important event, the Mcbride Commission report. And recently I wrote about the report and its politics in the journal Sublime Horizons. And we'll just read a short excerpt before I make my concluding remarks. While in Vancouver in the 1970s, the world of communication technology was being transformed by the advent of McLuhanism, the critique of mass media from the Frankfurt School, the severe contestations of the Mcbride Commission on the New World Information and Communication Order, and the search for third cinema, culture was called into question as much as its history. The Mcbride Commission, in its final report titled Many Voices, One World, summarized the multitude of research papers that underwrote the call for a new world order. The fate of the report and unprecedented opposition by the Western powers, especially the United States, demonstrated how hard it is to give others voice. One of the impacts of this heavy-handedness in crushing even the voicing of an alternative and differently imagined world and its history discouraged further struggles around these issues at the United Nations. So you can see that these contestations extend across multiple forums and beyond exhibition making that we saw in our discussion of modernism. And they were really defining the ethos of the endeavor of the political project of Canadian culture. So in my concluding thoughts, I believe there is an opportunity for Massey College to take intellectual leadership in defining the avenues of the thought processes and possibilities of envisioning the cultural future of Canada and its imperative in the longue durée. Key thematics emerge that beckon us, as would Vincent Massey if he were to be with us today. And drawing upon the spirit of the Massey, I think we're faced with three clear choices to act on. One, art is a public good. It is one of the central notions of the Massey Report that of public good and commons is at risk today. The demise of the Canadian Conference of the Arts in 2012 is a case in point. A multidisciplinary national arts advocacy body, which was found 4 years prior to the Massey, was the voice of art as a public good. We need to build nationwide literacy of arts and cultural institutions. Art has been instrumentalized to serve the private good. Similarly, public institutions, and especially cultural ones, are facing tremendous uphill task given the intergenerational loss of historical knowledge of these public institutions. Much is not reflected in the curriculum across secondary and post-secondary entities, and this has a direct bearing upon the public policy discourse, which becomes an act of regurgitating and an exercise of reinventing the wheel. I'm almost done. Given the ascendancy of neoliberalism since the 1980s, we see the spirit and ethos of the public good and commons have been chipped away, and restoring their centrality is paramount to safeguarding the very fabric and idea of democracy. The other thing I just want to, couple more things is as I end, is the role of art in international relations. I did give a keynote on cultural diplomacy at the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art, and I made a case for decolonization of cultural diplomacy and cultural policy because there's been a real problem within this modernist framework of the study of international relations, which gives primacy to the nation state and its security. Religion, culture, nor science and technology are being taken into the envelope for cultural diplomacy. And as a corrective, I'm actually working on an anthology, Art and International Relations, artist networks and institutions. And then I think the final thing, leading a pathway to decolonize cultural policy. And this is there's an increasing attention to one fact, as one writer clearly states. Cultural policies and institutions have been identified as important vectors for colonial discourse and its legitimation in both colonies and the metropolis, that is to say, the central hubs of colonial power. The scars of colonialism are still affecting cultural policies, institutions, and their professionals. Our current cultural controversies highlight the ethical challenges at stake. Now, I just say that I was born in the Mau Mau movement. I lived in a segregated Kenya, fighting on the front lines of inequities in the 70s and 80s in Vancouver, and have really been focused on excavating the contested nature of ideas and much of the original thinking that this era has produced. You know, I've been questioning why and how a generation that worked during the 70s and 80s could produce such powerful contestations through a new vocabulary of power. And today, neoliberalism has stripped us from this ability to produce this new thinking. It's repackaged it and has served it back to us in a sanitized way. And in a globalizing world, I think the possibility of critical work on this period opens up for a wide range of possibilities when it comes to creating a normative framework. Truth and reconciliation is one critical touchstone that we need to address first. It is imperative to have a critical appreciation of the locus of the ideas and historic reach of the Massey Report via politics of decolonization and solidarity movements. It is here that I look to your leadership, Natalie, to embark on this endeavor and to realize the genius of the Massey Report in today's world and that of the future. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think you make a really important point about the need to dust off the Massey Report and go back to its essence, art as a public good. What would be the next step? What's missing? I mean, there's a lot of people that have been talking about both the decolonization aspect of it. Is it possible to maintain the institutions that exist and still achieve decolonization? Or do we need to rethink even the idea of the Archives Canada or the National Film Board? So what would be the next step on an institutional front? Mm-hmm. And are there other things that you'd like to see outside of basic income for artists? Are there other things that you'd like to see?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you, because the three things that I point out is first we need to really build literacy back. I think we need to understand or people need to understand, or the public need to understand, what art is and why it is a public good and what its role, its central role in society is. That's one. I spoke about the international relations part, but I'll just use the art gallery sector as a good example, as I'm the executive director of the association. And when I got the job, I said, boy, I wonder if they know who they've hired. Because my job would be, of course, given my trajectory of work and the agency with which I feel, is that galleries should decolonize. And how do they actually go about doing that? And it's very interesting, because I think that the conversation gets often diverted to, oh, we'll do diversity and inclusion. Sorry, diversity and inclusion is not decolonization. Decolonization really calls upon institutions to look at where the power resides. In a gallery, it's in the collections. It's a colonial mandate. And I'm leading the sector into this sort of digital transformation at the moment, and really focused on building data literacy. And we know that all the mechanisms to understand data comes from a colonial powered place. How do we turn that over? It's embedded in it. So I think first is to understand that, and then find the ways that we can turn those places around. It won't be enough to just have, oh, we've shown our quota of 3 Indigenous shows, here are my metrics, here are the tactics, I've done it, I can go back and get more money. I'm sorry. So this requires some thought. It requires people to come together. It requires a lot of discourse and a lot of literacy building, in my opinion, and from the work that I do.
Yes, so certainly not just about including things to an existing structure, but rethinking that structure and trying to do so collectively.
Yeah.
The microphone is ready for other questions.
Hi, Zainub. Thank you so much for that. It was a wonderful opportunity to listen to such a thorough analysis. My name is Raji Ajla, and I wanted to ask you a question on how your analysis intersects with technology and just the advancements of innovation and the impact that's had on cultural consumption and newer audiences.
Lovely question, and thank you for asking it. I just recently did a podcast with Derowitz, and it's really looking at the political economy of culture, and really now where we are, where artists have been promised so much. You can put everything, you can put something online, you can put your music, you can do this, you can do that, and actually the platform economy is giving money to very few people and very little to artists who are finding themselves more impoverished. There's many aspects of the technology that we can speak about, but remember that it's how it's being used and for whom it is being used, against whom, and I think that's the real question. And all through, artists always engage with whatever they are given and whatever they are able to work with. But it's also very guided by what funding they get, and that is guided by the state. And technology also has this similar place there. You can only do so much, you can only do this. But at the end of the day, I think it's because we're in a platform economy is really strangling a lot of the artists because they actually don't have power there. And I'm not sure if I've answered your question completely, but I can definitely direct you to this podcast, which sort of lays out this trajectory between, moving artists along. And actually, and he wrote a book called The Death of the Artist.
Oh, a last question sounds very final. Oh dear. My name is Heather Lotherington, and I'm very attracted by the notion of literacy that you talk about. But my career has been in a very different kind of literacy, and I want to ask you a rather silly question, and it is this, that the notion of Canadian culture was skewered in the 70s and 80s by Bob and Doug McKenzie on the Great White North in Second City TV, which is a odd thing to bring up in such a meaty and well-researched talk. But in essence, they were critiquing something that should be near and dear to your heart, the extremely narrow notion of Canadian culture. I wonder if I could probe you to comment on moves such as that in cultural media, and how, whether they helped, didn't help, where they would fall.
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. Actually, I'm not sure I know exactly what you're referring to. But it's something that I would like to think about and find out more about, and maybe come back to you on that. Yeah.
So do I need the microphone? Okay. We could certainly continue talking. These are such important topics, but we have unfortunately run out of time. So I'd like to thank if you could join me in thanking Zainub Verjee for her very thought-provoking talk, and also thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.